Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Voyage podcast. I'm your host, Mike.
And I'm Jacob.
And today we're going to be talking about mimetic desire, mimetic crisis, and the scapegoat, all great stuff related to Rene Girard and how that ties into mythology, fiction, literature, pop culture, but most importantly, Christian theology.
Sounds fantastic.
And that enthusiasm you're hearing is Jacob. That's because he's probably kind of sick of me talking with him about this, and so now that we're finally able to record, he maybe, I don't know, you feeling a little burnt out about mimetic desire, Jacob?
Well, wait. So here's the question, because we've actually tried to do this episode already, and there was all kinds of wonky technical issues. So are we going to have the luxury of bringing all that wonderful recording into this episode, or do you think we're just starting over?
Well, I feel like I'm ready at the drop of a hat to just get right into this. I feel like I'm at a fever, like I've just been pent up for weeks. So
yes, I know.
I've always been at this point. I'm always ready to go. So,
well,
as you can probably, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I was more for your sake, Mike. I wasn't sure you could do what a, great presentation again, but
I'm pretty sure you're describing the podcast in general when you say for my sake. I think this is just kind of a...
You're a taskmaster, man. What can I say?
Well, and I'm sure everybody will hear this plenty of times throughout the podcast, that this is really just an opportunity for me to recognize how clever and creative I am. And so this is just another opportunity for us to do that, right?
And just an opportunity for me to make fun of you for, your abject humility.
Yeah, yeah. Well, to that note, I thought you were going to, I was expecting a little bit more praise for the title of the show because of how clever it was.
The Scape-GOAT.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's
clever.
That's just me trying to connect, right? So, because that's how we talk.
You looked this up, didn't you? And this has not been memed yet? Like, the internet has not scapegoated Jesus yet?
Which, to be honest, is probably one of the biggest tragedies in contemporary culture, is that we have not, especially since Rene Girard, it was Jesus that made him really come full circle with this concept. And
we're gonna have to scapegoat the internet for not scapegoating Jesus.
Something like that. Yeah,
sure,
we'll work out the details. Yeah, that's fine.
We'll work out the details, what that even means. Yeah.
So what we wanted to do for this one is, first we are going to get into a little bit of the background. I don't want to spend a ton of time on the background of mimesis, mimetic desire, mimetic crisis, and scapegoat, because that's actually going to be the subject of the two minisodes that go with this conversation.
Oh, okay. See, because I was about to say, Mike, there's so much opportunity for you to talk. Yeah, I'm shocked that, but then it's like, oh, you're gonna talk. You're just gonna do it without me.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's just because not only am I humble, but I'm charitable to you, that I'm giving you that free time. So
yeah,
I would never squander those opportunities.
Where are you recording? Where are you recording today, Mike?
That's an undisclosed location, and in about 2.5 minutes, we'll have to pause again for that as well.
Sure.
But so we will go over those concepts in very briefly soon. But then really the main part of the conversation that we want this to be about is, where do we see this played out in contemporary culture, in contemporary fiction, but also ancient mythology, which, like I said, it was in the ancient examples that Rene Girard really came across this idea, not only with Jesus, but then looking at ancient mythology, Greek mythology especially. But we see it's ubiquitous. It shows up all the time in especially our fiction and pop culture. Most recently, it came up almost very explicitly in the TV show White Lotus. I don't know if you've seen that one, Jacob. Are you familiar?
It's funny that you bring that up. I haven't watched it yet, but I read a fairly glowing review of it from a source that I would not have anticipated. Frankly, that type of cheap trash doesn't usually interest me, Mike. But, I'm not surprised that you happen to have watched it.
Very much have enjoyed both seasons so far. Yeah.
Honestly, I keep hearing good things about it. So I guess I'm going to have to check it out.
We will talk, not just about the mentions of mimetic desire, but we'll talk about that show a little bit, but it's not going to be the main part of the conversation either. So all of those pious fans that are listening, they don't need to cover their ears for too long at that part.
Okay, fair enough.
But then, after going through the pop culture references, contemporary examples, the biggest part of the theological part of the conversation is going to be, how does Jesus tie in as the scape, capital G, capital O, capital A, capital T, that scapegoat, that first Rene Girard recognized, but what are the details? How do we see that play out? And that's going to be the big part, kind of the second half of the conversation, or part two a little bit.
Now, hey, everyone who's listening here is getting GOAT, right? Greatest of all time. Typically applied to folks like Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan. It's a sports reference for people who... You say, I don't even do much of the sporting, so there's a time when I might not have even understood what that was. I'm just throwing it out there for my fellow nerds.
What are some examples? We'll first go over mimetic desire. So mimetic desire is basically this idea. Mimesis itself means imitation. Okay, so it comes from the Greek word for imitation. And so when we talk about mimetic desire, it's saying that our desires don't, in a sense, spring up out of nowhere, but that they are conditioned by other people, that they are imitating other people. And these people would be called models, or that's kind of the name that Girard gave, is our desires conditioned by these models. And it's not so much a question of if you have a model or don't, it's that who is your model? Everybody does have one. Starting with childhood. What's the obvious example in childhood? Every kid wants to be like his or her mom or dad, older brother, older sister, right?
Dog, cat.
That's
favorite cartoon character.
And we both have kids, Jacob. I'm sure you've seen this. Everybody talks about how there's a toy on the floor. Nobody cares about the toy until the one kid picks it up, and then the other sibling immediately wants that toy. It's like, where did that come from? Did they just all of a sudden realize that toy is valuable and worth playing with? Or did that toy gain value because of that model?
That's actually a pretty good example. A really, really obvious example of how this mimetic theory works, right? And it's heavily correlated with a sense of, if you're being cynical, you could call it envy, right? But
we'll get into that. Trust me. Yeah, don't worry, we'll get there. Yeah,
that's
No, keep going. Sorry.
No, you're right. You're not all right, but I'll let it slide. We both have babies right now. I have a 7-month-old. You have what, a
13
month? Yeah.
Sorry to make you do math. Yeah.
It's not my forte. And these early childhood, especially when they're so new, and you see them start to develop the interest in what their siblings are doing, right? Because, or even their parents, that kind of innate curiosity, I think, is really, really on display with fresh humans. But I think that type of obsession with what other humans are doing right out the gates, it's more than just curiosity. It's this innate learning mechanism and a developmental tool that we're all born with.
Oh yeah, and by no means am I trying to imply that it's a bad thing. And Girard wouldn't say that either. He would say that not only is it very natural, but it's how we, like you said, develop.
Why are you always knocking mimetic theory, Mike? What did Girard do to you?
By no means. No, absolutely not.
Everything I've ever heard, he was a perfect gentleman. And his theory has a lot of explanatory value. So I think you need to cool it.
And a devout Catholic, Jacob. I don't know if you realize. But
not everyone's perfect, Mike.
Yeah. So even though in my example, it's certainly an object of frustration for the parents. You just wanted that thing because your older brother had it. Now you guys are fighting about it. But really, it's like if that is exactly
your older brother was running off a cliff, would you do that too? That's the question.
Gosh, the cliff now has all this mystery surrounding it. It kind of creates that temptation, doesn't it? So So, no, like you said, it's very much a part of human development, not just on the small scale or the individual scale, but on the social scale. This is not just how an individual person grows, but how human communities grow and develop. And that, again, leads right into what Girard started to notice, is that that's how this mimetic desire works. So to keep going, it can actually be broken up into two kind of different subcategories in mimetic desire. So in the example I used, you have an example of the social world is very immediate. It's very close. It's within the family. That's what he would call internal mediation. And that's where we're talking, neighbors, friends, family members, things like that. But the other one, which is maybe seemingly a little bit less powerful, but certainly just as common, is called external mediation. And it's in this social world where we would get the examples of mimetic desire played out in celebrities. So this is why, by the way, there will always be celebrity endorsements and they will always work, is because of mimetic desire. You want that watch, not because you want that watch that George Clooney is wearing, not because George Clooney is an expert on watchmaking, but because you see George Clooney wearing that watch and you want the confidence of George Clooney. You want to be George Clooney and he's wearing the watch. Does that make sense?
Well, not really, but I'll roll with it. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I got you. The ramifications of this in this kind of social media age that we live in, in this kind of fear of missing out stuff, right? This is all tied into this idea of us being fundamentally social creatures. And when we say fundamentally social creatures, sometimes I don't think we realize that what that means is fundamentally mimetic creatures.
Well, and it's funny you bring up the social media example, not only because it works perfectly, but the modern Rene Girard scholars, that's exactly what they point to. That's the first thing that they point to, is how this is sort of taken mimetic desire, but also the mimetic crisis, which we'll get to in a second. And well, it's basically, it's taken it and it has blown it up. So yeah, it's made it everywhere. The other example,
too much of a good thing,
in external mediation. So not the ones who are closest to you within your social circle, like neighbors, friends, and family, but in external, you have celebrities who, even though, yeah, they live on Earth, but they live in a totally different world, totally different sphere as you. The other example that he includes is fictional characters and heroes and superheroes. And so this is why one of the big, it was in studying of literature that he started to see this happening. And then, as I've mentioned before, it's in the story of Jesus where this kind of really hit home for him, or really kind of came home, was this point. But our desires are conditioned by both of these worlds, but it's one of these worlds can lead to a much more, it kind of has a much more critical effect on us. So the closer the model is, there's a much higher likelihood of this thing called mimetic crisis. Okay, and so mimetic crisis is kind of the next sort of term that I want to kind of define very quickly before we keep going. And this is, like I said, based off of mimetic desire in that close social world, that internal mediation. And it's because the models in the social world they're more present to us. Okay, so again, it's you see the older sibling grab the toy and now you want to fulfill that same thing. And you recognize more acutely that you lack that fulfillment, right? It's not that I wanted the toy because of itself, but once I see my older sibling grab it, I recognize much more acutely that I don't have the toy.
Well, and I don't know if this is like where you're going with it or not, because spoiler alert, people, I do very little preparation for these. But the idea that what you have with the relationships in real life, when this mimetic relationship that we have with people in real life allows us to have I would say, authentic developmental kind of process, right? And just to harp back on the social media thing, I think what you might be going towards is that with social media, you have this kind of unrestrained and fundamentally unrealistic and ultimately untrue mimetic relationship with the mechanism is still playing out, but the authenticity is missing. And we still experience it at this phenomenological level, right? But it's screwy. It's not real, so I don't know.
Well, and no, certainly the level of real versus fake. That's definitely something worth covering when it comes to social media in general, and that's going to condition desire in the same way that we see all the gadgets in Batman, and that makes us want to have the gadgets of Batman.
Yes, it does.
There's a level of unreality that's going to obviously condition our desires there too. But anyway, so going back to this internal mediation, because we recognize that lack of fulfillment, and because that model is so close, we now see that model as a competitor or a rival. And this is where the crisis comes in, because now this is why there's the fight between the siblings. That younger sibling sees the older one as a competitor to the fulfillment of having that toy. And this happens more in internal mediation because, like I said, you're much closer to each other in that world. I don't see, the famous athlete or the famous actor as taking something of mine because he or she is living in a completely different world. I don't see Batman as taking something that should be mine because he literally lives in a fictional world. And so that's why the internal mediation is the thing that will cause that crisis.
What's interesting about that is what I would say. At the same time, you do have a history in philosophy of kind of class warfare paradigms, right? That's really always kind of present. Really, if you pay attention to any politics across the last 200 years, it's really dominated by conversations around the kind of societal hierarchy, and class warfare kind of covers this concept and things like that. That's kind of applicable to what you're describing here, though. Even though I don't think that I'm in the same sphere as Bill Gates, yet I'll still, or Elon Musk, or anybody, right? But I'll still judge them for having a better life than me, or something to that effect, or envy their status or wealth or whatever. But admittedly, it's true. Like if I see, of course, then again, I've never been a basketball player, and if anyone ever saw me in real life, they'd understand why. So maybe I'm just not prone to be jealous of somebody like Michael Jordan. But
there again,
probably dating myself with Michael Jordan references, right?
Yeah, but people still know him as a mythological figure anyway. So no, but there again, all you're actually describing by saying because you're not a basketball player, that just shows another degree of separation, another world. Not just even if I'm a basketball player, I'm still not living in the same world as the best basketball player or the best group of basketball players in the NBA. But now, if I'm not even somebody playing basketball, that just is another world of separation. So you're describing this idea of external versus internal mediation exactly, just from your kind of point of view or your experience.
Hey, Kobe Bryant, did he die in a helicopter crash?
He did. It actually would be 3 years ago.
Oh man, I apologize to all. I sincerely apologize to all the Kobe Bryant fans out there. Oh no.
That was yeah. That actually is about 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks from now. It'd be the 3-year anniversary.
That's just I'm really not into sports, folks. But yeah, all due respect to the GOAT, Kobe Bryant.
So this actually, what happens here is in this crisis, it doesn't actually just work one way, because then you'll have the person who will, their desire for whatever the thing is conditioned by the model, and then they try to fulfill or meet that desire. And that will be noticed by because they're in this close sphere, it'll go back and forth. And this is where, if you've ever heard the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, that's essentially what you're describing is mimetic desire. But because it's in this internal mediation, this close social world of a neighborhood, everybody's desire is conditioned by the neighbor next door who gets the new car, who gets the new thing, who just painted their house and so it looks nice and new again, or whatever the case is. And so it just keeps going up and up and up. And
well, and honestly, I don't think it's a problem for me to keep bringing social media into this, though maybe it's annoying, I'm not sure. But that's where the division between the kind of immediate mimetic desire and then the kind of mythical mimetic desire starts to get blurred in our 21st century, because the difference between me and somebody like Bill Gates back in the 90s would have been,
it flattens,
it just would not have come up.
It flattens out the world.
But social media, it makes us think that we should have the lives of people who are outside of our social class, let's say, right? Even though, and the only reason we feel that way is because the internet has, like you said, kind of flattened us into this kind of ultimately democratic worldview, right? Like, and I say that not as someone who's against democracy, but hey, as a good Orthodox Christian, I'm not at all opposed to hierarchy.
Yeah.
And I think hierarchy happens, and
sacred order.
There you
Sacred
go.
order.
See, I'm glad you finally explained something. Like, but the social, our kind of democratization of status, that kind of crept in through the idea of democracy itself and voting and things like that, one person, one vote type ideas, has started to shape our perceptions of reality itself. And suddenly we have this mimetic crisis where we feel like we should be experiencing life the same way. Everyone should be experiencing life the same way. And it doesn't matter what your circumstances are. And that leads to loathing, whether it's self-loathing or the loathing of the other. And now we're coming back to the idea.
So you have this back and forth, which will inevitably lead to resentment, and that'll build, and then that'll eventually spill over into violence. And like you said, it could be violence against the self, and it doesn't even have to be physical violence, although historically or in ancient cultures, this is what mythology and Girard will show us too, is that it was maybe more overtly physically violent, but it can still just be as, non-physically violent as well. So again, this is the crisis.
The self-loathing is psychologically speaking, it amounts to loathing the other, right? Because most of our self-loathing is kind of unconscious, and we project it onto other people and things like that. Subconscious, unconscious. Unconscious is when you're asleep. Subconscious is what's underneath your thoughts. Is that right?
Very good. All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Right.
this resentment, this violence, if continued unchecked and on a wide enough scale, it breaks down communities, and this is the crisis. And it's this escalation of more and more violence until they need to find some outlet, someone or something to take on this resentment, this anger, this bitterness, in a sense, taking on the sins of the community. Gosh, imagine if there was some concept of something or someone taking on the sins of a community.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Never heard of it.
So, and this is, where the scapegoat concept comes from. And the title scapegoat, so we see that show up in the book of Leviticus. But like I said, it's not just a Bible thing. This is a human thing. It is ancient communities. It's more modern communities. Now, the difference that Girard would point out in his research that he noticed is there was something that changed with Christianity in regards to humanity's relationship to the scapegoat. And not just 2,000 years ago with Jesus, but really in Christianity itself, there was a change. But anyway, so that's the scapegoat and the role that it has always played in relationship to mimetic desire and mimetic crisis. Now, we got to go through some scapegoats because there have been a lot. So can you think of, what are some scapegoats that you can kind of think of, or what are some that stand out to you in just, watching movies, reading books, whatever?
Can I just say that we really missed an opportunity in preparing for this show where we should have gotten a goat bleat soundbite. And then at this point, we could have been like, scapegoat, bleh, scapegoat, bleh.
If we had to do that every time we said the word, there would be nothing but that sound the entire time. Yeah.
That might be too much. But if we're rattling off examples,
Oh,
I'm just trying to creative these things up, Mike. I'm a creative fellow, Okay, examples of scapegoats. Did we say Jesus yet?
Oh, okay. Well, let's go through fiction first. Now that we're going to try to be, unless you're trying to be edgy, Jacob. Is that?
Okay.
I mean, the first one that came to my mind was if you read Lord of the Flies book or watched the Lord of the Flies movie, but Piggy in Lord of the Flies is definitely
Piggy.
a scapegoat. Yeah. So he definitely.
He had a happy ending though, didn't he? I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Wait a second. What?
Yeah. So again, if you're familiar with that story at all, you have these boys stranded on a deserted island or whatever, and they have to build a community in a sense based on their young adult male understanding of what that means. And they try to set down a law, set down rules. They are experiencing these different things around them. They almost create a sort of like pseudo religion kind of. And that then
it's a dark book,
It's a
but it's a
bleak,
really
yeah.
fantastic. It's a because it's such a it really just it captures human nature so well and so authentically.
fallen human nature. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, well, for sure, yeah. I stand corrected. But without you ever there's no question when you read that book. It's like, yep, that's how it would play out, and that's exactly what humans are.
And
you know?
yeah, and well, him
It's all
taking that
roses
role.
and cream, everybody. It's a idyllic utopia.
So and Piggy, I mean, he is given that nickname, and he kind of he's described as the less desirable member of this kind of group. He kind of becomes the one that takes on the resentment, the anger, the bitterness of a lot of the other boys, and it does eventually lead to his death. And so there again, and even once he does die, there becomes this sort of like almost like dark unity around, now not all the boys, and like I said, I'm trying to be somewhat vague. I mean, it's an old book, not total spoilers, I guess, or kind of spoiler alert, but
I just can't believe Piggy died.
there's a sort of unity that's created around it, which, going back to Girard's thing, that was the role of the scapegoat, is that when all of this violence and escalation builds up, there needs to be an outlet, and it's in the sacrifice of that scapegoat where all of that bitterness and resentment gets to sort of like be released temporarily. It was never permanent. And so, but we do see it for a short time.
Well,
like I said,
here's a really good example. Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery.
Okay.
Who's familiar with that one? Have you read that one, Mike?
The story sounds familiar, but I couldn't describe to you off the top of my head right now.
You might. Well, all right. So it's pretty famous. It came out in like the 60s, I think, is when she wrote it. Maybe it was the 50s. But it's about a small town. It's a really short story, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Okay, yep.
And there's a lottery. Yeah. All right. So now you remember what I'm talking about.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So basically, and it's been a long time since I've read this, but I'm pretty sure I remember it. You have this town that's super idyllic again. Everything works really, really smoothly, and everyone's happy and neighborly. And, Leave It to Beaver or the Andy Griffith Show, Mayberry type situation. But every year there's this ritual that occurs where the entire townsfolk come to the town square, and there's a name drawn. Or it's like pebbles are handed out or something like that. And what you discover to your horror as a reader is that once a year, this idyllic community comes together and sacrifices someone at random. That basically maintains this community. And it's almost, it's been a long time since I've read it, so I don't even think that they even really bother explaining how it does it.
That's probably part of the like mystery and like almost like eeriness of the story.
Well, 100%. You're not really allowed to understand what's happening. You're really just kind of a witness to it. But as such, it's the perfect encapsulation of this idea that the act of violence in and of itself is a unifying, pacifying reality for a community, and that it doesn't even have to be justified. Like, it doesn't have to be explained, right? Typically there's going to be some kind of justification offered, but the Shirley Jackson story basically posits, at least for the experience of the reader, Unless I've just forgotten some details, folks, and I'm really imbuing this with greater
No.
kind of mystery.
Like I said, once you got it started, I was like, oh yeah, I do know this one. Yep.
There's no explanation. You don't even, and yet somehow there's just something believable about the idea that all we have to do is just kill somebody once a year, and everything else, that just keeps everyone in line.
Well, and there again, what's perfect about this, and like I said, because this goes back to ancient humanity, like all of humanity, you can find this. That kind of speaks to your point of it wasn't explained until, like, for so much of it, it was just accepted. And so there again, the fact that somebody kind of makes a more contemporary kind of version of that idea played out and not explaining it, that almost like illustrates a deeper truth around it too.
I'm really looking forward to, I don't know if we're going to do it just yet or not, but getting into the kind of ancient kind of, understandings of sacrifice and things like that. I'm sure that's going to come up in this episode, but it creates some fascinating conversation, I would think. And you mentioned it briefly at the top of the show, where you're saying that like Girard got this out of ancient sources, right? Because what you're saying right now is that like it wasn't necessarily explained in those ancient sources either, and that might be true in the sense that like pagan sacrifices, people who were sacrificed, it really could be anybody, right? And oftentimes it was just a matter of who was caught or who was, just using some kind of like random pig or well, not a pig in the Old Testament, I guess.
And like I said, I kind of tried to cut it a little bit short just because, yeah, you could do multiple episodes on each, mimetic desire, mimetic crisis. But what follows the scapegoat event, you could say, is that people, like you were kind of describing, they notice how it brings them together, how it creates this sort of pseudo unity. And so then they start to almost like memorialize it and ritualize it. And that's where, like you were saying, it becomes this regular thing of sacrifice. Like this is part of our liturgy. This is part of our worship. It's almost like this was happening first, and then we formed the trappings of ritual or religion around it, so to speak. And so and not, I should say, not to like, that doesn't undermine the presence of religion. In a sense, it almost shows that it does naturally flow from us. Even fallen humanity, it will naturally flow from.
Well, that's what I was just about to say, is that what it really demonstrates is the innateness of this paradigm. And I mean that in the sense of a created order, right? Now, again, you could get into some really murky theological water when you start asking questions about like what ifs, like did God have to make the world this way, or what's the difference between the created order and the fallen created order? Like there's lots of questions that can arise when we start talking like this, but I'm not going to I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff.
No. I mean,
but what I'm going to say,
sacrifice
is
itself could be its own episode too. We just want to do scapegoat for this. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's just that what I do believe is that Christ is the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, right? To quote that scripture out of Revelation. And that there is something where I think it's fairly safe theologically to say that at the very least, when God created this world, he knew this world was going to be what this world is, right? Regardless of what his actual intent was, as opposed to what he allowed to happen, blah, blah, blah. Nevertheless, there's this idea that creation itself begins with Jesus, right? With his incarnation, sacrifice, and resurrection. That's the template for reality itself.
And yeah, just to not by no means to almost to yes and your point, when we say that this is a reflection of God's nature, it doesn't mean that the violence is a reflection of God's nature. It's almost saying that sacrifice itself predates violence, because we would say that the pouring out of the Father is the act of begetting the Son. And so the Son's nature is this sort of like given of oneself over. And so that's why we see it modeled perfectly by Jesus here on earth, is because that's what he's always been from all eternity. That's what the Son is. So it's not so much that because Jesus models sacrifice, there had to be, violence before sin or before the fall, or that God was like predicting that there would be sin or violence. Because even to talk about God in terms of time, that's already kind of like seeing God as not God, right? Or putting God in a box. It's almost like you gotta flip it around and say, what if sacrifice predates violence? It was never meant to be violent. We have just, in a fallen world, sacrifice had to include violence, right?
Yeah.
Whether it was violence of an animal or violence of a person.
That is a manifestation of sacrifice. And so it's interesting to apply it to the way sacrifices have been made in the context of worship. Even Old Testament's sanctified worship as dictated to Moses. There's no undue cruelty related to the animal sacrifices that occur there. We don't really know exactly how the animals were killed, but the implication is that they didn't need to be tortured, right? It'd be akin to our basic consumption of animals today, where, you hope that there, and certainly many places, it's a simple dealing of death, right? For the sake of acquiring the meat kind of thing. So I guess taking life is violent in and of itself, I suppose, but the taking of sacrificial, like animal life, is not inherently, it's not cruel. It's the necessary killing of something, right?
Well, and certainly when we're talking about examples in fiction, those are going to be violent because that's what's going to make the story more dramatic too. So whether we're talking Piggy, whether we're talking The Lottery, whether we're talking Harry Potter in the Harry Potter series, he's very much, he's described in the last book as a lamb to the slaughter.
Wait a second though, Mike. It's one thing to spoil... Piggy or something.
I just said how he was described. As a
lamb.
So, and by the way, Harry Potter's been around long enough too. It's like, but
it's such a good series that I am so loath to ruin that for anybody. But shame on you if you haven't experienced that story, at least through the movies. Come on, you lazy bums.
And
watch the movies.
And I feel like yours was the bigger spoiler because you were getting so excited about me, whereas like now somebody knows something's up. But like I said, if you have not been living in this world, if you're not familiar in a large part to that, or you're just totally not interested and the spoiler doesn't matter anyway. But then there's also the if you're familiar with the Hunger Games book series and then the movie series as well, very much the tributes, and then obviously the main character, very much a scapegoat for the kind of power structure that is described in that novel, or in the series, I should say. But yeah, we talked a little bit at the beginning about how mimetic desire, it's actually brought up as mimetic desire. It's like, in none of those other examples, nobody's saying, Katniss, you're the scapegoat, or Piggy, you're going to be the scapegoat. But here, the character, and I can give a little bit of background, of course, but one of the characters actually talks about and uses the phrase mimetic desire and like kind of throws it in the other character's face. So in that series, which again, the basic premise of the show in general is...
Wait, which one are you talking about?
I was talking about the White Lotus. We already talked about the White Lotus at the beginning.
Okay.
So in the White Lotus...
I thought we were still on Katniss. That's all I'm saying.
The premise of the show is each season is a group of unrelated characters who are all going on like a vacation to some fancy resort spot. And what I think is really kind of interesting about the show is if you've ever kind of had this thought or this feeling, but it's almost built on this premise that like a vacation kind of brings out the real you, the best or the worst of you. It'll bring out the best of a person because that's who they really are. They're not bogged down by work, not bogged down by responsibilities. But it could also bring out the worst in a person in terms of entitlement, in terms of disrespect, that sort of thing. So I feel like it does it, but because you have, this wide variety or relatively wide variety of characters, it does it from all these different facets or all these different angles. And one of the groups in the most recent season, it's two sets of married couples, and the guys were roommates in college. And you hear through the various episodes, just, sharing a little bit about like their experience in college. Oh, it's been so long, blah, blah, blah. But you hear how the one guy whenever he would find out that the other guy like had a crush on a girl or liked a girl, he would go and sleep with the girl first. And you also find throughout the show that he has also been kind of making like subtle suggestive remarks to the other guy's wife. And the guy, and again, it's starting to bubble over, so again, this is where the crisis or the resentment kind of comes in. But the guy says back to him, like, you're not your own person. Like, you're conditioned by this mimetic desire. Like, I'm the model that you're conditioning your desires off for. You're always going after the girl I like because I liked her. You're going after my wife because I married her. And so he throws it back in the guy's face. And like I said, it's obvious. I'm giving a very brief kind of overview, and this is done over like 10 episodes. I think it's 10 episodes, but I just remember when that episode, when I was watching, I was like, oh my gosh, it was,
how convenient.
Yeah, it was, well, yeah. Cause I mean, as we're recording this, the season just came out like, 2 or 3 months ago or something. So like I'm watching it as we're getting ready, and yeah, it's that meme of Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the TV screen when he sees something, that was like me in my living room, like, oh, there it is,
Yeah,
so,
right.
So no, it's a perfect, and like I said, it's perfect. Not only was it presented perfectly, but it's not like this is a well-known thing that everybody, like, if anything, people are going to talk about the scapegoat. They're not going to talk about the mimetic desire and the mimetic crisis that precedes it, and really are the necessary components. You can't have the scapegoat without those things first,
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check that show out. The one thing that I'll say that,
I mean,
what's it?
Yeah, I was going to say, for sensitive eyes and ears, like I'm not gonna sugarcoat it.
Mike
like,
Schramm completely endorses this show and considers it essential
spiritual edification,
essential viewing. Yes, so let it be known.
Yeah, exactly. I'll get canceled from the Voyage audience, I guess.
And it's not because there's a mimetic crisis of me envying you, Mike.
That's just my justification. That's my justification.
Don't even go there.
I just use that to like.
No, so I've been working through this kind of growing understanding of spiritual realities, right? As the ancient church has talked about it, and has different theologians have expressed it, but also how it's engaged with within modern psychology and things like that. One of my personal interest is trying to bring back together a unified view of reality, right? Because ever since the Enlightenment, we've had this bifurcated reality where there's the secular or the profane and the sacred, which those concepts predate, but they are not. They evolved. That understanding has evolved post-Enlightenment into basically like what's real and what's like magic, right? And so I am trying to undo that in myself and be able to appropriately perceive reality as constantly sacred and constantly a spiritual experience.
The veil has been torn.
Right. That's easier said than done, but it's been a fascinating journey.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the, in one sense you could look at this as a sort of like, oh, it's just a deconstruction. It's saying it's all not real. And I would say, no, I mean, you can still call it a deconstruction, but I would say, if anything, it makes the secular, quote unquote, secular or mundane more real. It actually ties those two together more, not to thin one out, but to supplement the other.
Well, let me clarify.
And that kind of goes into what you're saying.
Yeah. What I was going with that is that this interaction that we have with each other, this mimetic interaction where we're constantly engaging with each other through this process of responding to each other, basically, that creates these spiritual realities, or maybe not creates, but it basically funnels spiritual realities. This is getting pretty woo-woo, and it's going to take it's going to take a while to unpack that,
But the best sort of spiritual connection between this is actually what we find first in the Old Testament scriptures, but then ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, which, lucky for everybody else, that's exactly what we're going to talk about in part 2 of this conversation, which I'm really looking forward to getting into because, yeah, we went through the pop culture stuff and we're going to tie that back into, but really where we see this in a really interesting way is in the Old Testament, where we see the scapegoat and even before the scapegoat, but then ultimately in Jesus. So that's what I am looking forward to talking about next.
Yeah. And honestly, this came up right at the end here, so I haven't had time to really unpack what I was even trying to get to yet. But stand by for it, because this is the stuff that really interests me.
Yeah, this will be good. Everybody, be sure to like, subscribe, follow this podcast. Give us a 5-star review, because that'll help us kind of generate a bigger audience, get us out to more people, just so that we can keep talking about these really interesting ideas, which, I mean, I just love. So thank you guys very much.
Oh, insert funny statement. Bye.
Yeah, very good.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.